Good afternoon, Friday, February 29th. How are you all? I hope you're well. The sun was out and now it went away. All right. So I want to try to do a couple things today. I want to talk about this word that keeps popping up in my emails this week, and that is the word representation. So, what is representation? What does that mean? And you know what? I bet you it doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. So, and then I want to talk a little bit about behind the scenes, because I think there's the things that come to council, that come before council, that we make decisions on, but it is such a small portion of the job that we do. And there's lots that happens before those things come to council, and there's lots that happen after those things come to council. So I want to talk a little bit about that, recognizing we only have 15 minutes. Okay, so what is representation? So what does it mean to have a representative at the elected level? I think it means something different for everybody, but I can say this, it's not a science. So there is no formula that goes into this. All 15 of us on council do this job a very different way. There are hundreds of elected officials across the province who do this in a different way. And that is everything from your local councillor to your MLA to your member of parliament. Everyone does this job a little bit different, and that's a good thing, because that is essentially the heart of democracy, is that there are different people with different backgrounds and interests and talents and expertise and knowledge that, when combined, make decisions at a majority on a majority, right, when those votes come to decide what is next, for a city, for a province, or for our country. So fundamentally, representation does not mean that your elected official is always going to do what you want them to do. It actually, because it's not a science, there's no perfection in that. And I could argue, and everyone could say where they probably feel more or less represented. And that means that we would have to have some sort of consensus. So let's just talk about Ward 11. There's 105,000 people in Ward 11. Okay, so let's just say that half of those people are kids. There's 50,000 people in Ward 11. I am not under the illusion at all that all 50,000 people are going to share the same opinions on things. There are probably things that we maybe have all in common, but how we maybe get to something, I bet you we all have different ideas on those pathways. So what's my job? My job is to take in all of the feedback. So the other accusation I have to get is, you're not listening. I am listening. I hear you. I hear all of you, and I hear what you want, but I'm listening to all of you. So just a couple of emails that I've gotten this week, just to give you an example of the plethora of things that come my way. One, I got a proposal for a new tax idea. Some people may like this tax and some people may not. And the challenge is, how it was. So I have no problems with the idea being proposed, but one, typically people would say, like, oh, I don't want a new tax. Two, often when we also, there's like a provincial component. If we want to introduce a new tax, the province would have to approve it. And the third thing is, like, to take a tax and dedicate it towards one specific thing. So that was sort of the premise of this email, isn't actually what happens. So there's that. Two, I was someone told me that we should increase the budget by 0% every year, therefore making people's taxes go down. That's unrealistic. I think we all know that it's unrealistic. So I think generally, probably we can say there needs to be incremental growth in our budget. We need to pay people more every year so that their cost of living, right? Anyways, 0% budget increase year over year. And I was like, ooh. And those individuals, I say, show me somewhere that's working. If you have a case study for me, would love to read it. Now, that doesn't mean that we blow things out of the water. But if you knew the number of deferred projects that we have, the deferred spending, and the things that we're not getting to, and I can give you examples from Ward 11 alone. And I'll give you an example. So right now, that example, so rapid flashing beacons. So those are the crosswalks, those like flashy, blinky lights. Okay, those cost about $60,000 to $80,000 a piece to install. I probably could list at least 10 locations in Ward 11 alone that we need those, probably more. I bet you there's 20 locations to improve traffic safety, but we're going to go 10. We're going to average it out to $70,000. So $70,000 times 10 locations. That's $700,000 times 14 wards. You get the point. So we have to, as a ward, when we do get that budget, we have to then pick and choose where those go. So like that is a hard decision. How do I tell one community they're getting it and not another community? How do I prioritize safety? A lot of it is citizen advocacy, which means I'm listening, I hear you. And then a lot of it is also just like then the data and the metrics. So where are there reports of incidents and accidents? What is the road condition there? What other improvements have or have not been done in the community or around the area? So then we have to look at all of these things to make our decisions. And so the decisions that we make based on the funding that we get and the inputs that we get from citizen, we have to balance that against policy goals and objectives, research goals and objectives, and what we know about the area, and all of these things. So again, it's not a science. We try to narrow it down. We try to make the best possible decisions. Well, I know when I choose someplace for a rapid flashing beacon, what's going to happen if there's 27 communities in Ward 11. If I put it somewhere, 26 other communities are going to say, how come I didn't get it? And I'm going to have to systematically break it down for them and say, here's why. It doesn't mean that I don't want to get you one. It's just the trade-off is if you want them faster, sooner, is the trade-off that you're willing to pay more taxes, because that's what it's going to take, because it's operating funding. So that's one thing. So those are the kind of advocacy pieces that we get. And then, so when people say like have budget spending and restraint, that's one example of where we have incredible budget spending and restraint. And we have those kind of examples for a lot of things. Facility management is the other really big one. We have a lot of facilities that are needing capital upgrades, and we're deferring a lot of that. And that's why some things are falling down. So I've been told to spend less, and then I've been and then stay in my lane, don't talk about anything on the provincial level. And then I've similarly had someone tell me of all the things they wanted me to advocate for to the federal government, the municipal government, and then to my colleagues. And it was like a very, very long list. So some are achievable, some are not. But I'm also only one person who can only advocate for so many things. So one was a tax relief. So I've been asked for a tax increase and a tax relief this week. I've been asked for both things. So representation is not a science. It's super tricky. And like everyone, I do my best. I campaigned on the values of supporting communities, on ensuring that underrepresented voices were heard. And sometimes silence means that people aren't speaking up. And so you have to actively go seek out those voices. And so I've been really intentionally trying to do that. So the voices that come to our inbox, again, totally varied. But there's also a lot of voices that don't hit our inbox. And so it's often about working with organizations and groups who are connected into those individuals and trying to seek out those individuals to make sure that that is coming forward and part of the work that we do. A huge part of those underrepresented voices are youth. And so when I am going into schools and talking to schools, which I do every year, I often ask youth about what they want in the city for the future. And I said that I would do that, and I have been doing that. And what I hear from my youth is not the same as what I hear from probably their grandparents at this point. And I say that because, so I have a 13-year-old and a 10-year-old, and I also have my mom and my stepdad and my dad who are in their 60s. And I can tell you that the things that they want are not aligned. So my kids are thinking about what they want for the future. My parents are definitely talking about what do they want right now. And they're not aligned at all. And so how do I balance representation of both of those groups? Because I do actually equally need to represent people who are under 18 as I do for those who are over 60. So it's not a science. It's not a perfect. And the scale is always tipping back and forth. And a lot of what our youth are wanting from us as elected representatives, they are, so I'm going to say this, I think collectively there is, I don't want to say fear, but there is, people are scared of change. So our youth are actually afraid that we're not changing fast enough. And the older generation is afraid that we're changing too fast. So like, this is the balance that we're sitting in. And so representation is I'm going to keep saying it. It's not a science. And a lot of people think it's a science. A lot of people think that because they tell me something, it is what everybody else wants and thinks because they're living in that confirmation bias group, typically of their peers, right? So my 13-year-old thinks all 13-year-olds think the same. My 60-year-old people think all 60-year-old people think the same. 40-year-olds think all 40-year-old people think the same, and that's actually not true either. But people tend to hang out with people with like-minded, and so they make assumptions, and we all do this, right? We all assume that we all like cheese on our pizza, but maybe not everybody does. So I think what I go back to is I do hear you. I do hear what your concerns are. I want to mitigate them as best as I possibly can, but know that I'm balancing them against one, other people's concerns, which could be totally opposite to yours. Two, the research that exists globally and the policy that we currently have, and also where we're going. And it's really, for me, about the forward looking and trying to create spaces and places for as many people as possible in the most affordable way possible, which is why I will always advocate for transit fares to be as low as possible. It helps people one, get around a lot with a lot more cost effective, but also a broader than transit service, if we can get to that, allows people to go more places too, and that's really super important. So I'm going to really quickly go through like 10 behind the scenes things that I am working on that may never even hit the floor of council because they are just things that don't always need a resolution. So, and I'll maybe go through, are they going to come to council or not? So policies and procedures to create fairness and equity on our boards and committees, and the governance restructuring to remove what I call political interference on boards and committees. So in other words, removing appointments to boards and committees by elected officials and instead leaving those appointments or the recommendations for those appointments to the committees themselves and or to third-party groups. So some of that will come to council and some of that won't come to council. So then the second part of that is the support with the governance and accountability for best practices of boards and committees. I was at an AGM last night. It definitely didn't follow Robert's rules. And when you sit in council and you follow procedure bylaw, which is based on Robert's rules after you've been doing that for a couple of years and have run your own board meetings, when you see things not going by Robert's rules, it gives you like the creepies and you're kind of like, oh, can I just help you run this meeting? But I didn't. But that is something we can help with. And so working a lot with our civic partners and some of our other organizations to talk about board governance and support so that one, there's great documentation, and two, so that if they do get asked those hard questions on how are you making these decisions or why did this decision, they can easily back it up and people can understand it and support it. So that's a big one. So since the very beginning, a lot of advocacy to the provincial government for increased funding for preventative social programs. So that's family community support services. So have been working on that super diligently, along with my peers across the province. So a lot of cross-provincial work happening there. I am working and talking around inclusive hiring at the City of Calgary for people with intellectual disabilities. This may or may not come to council. But these are individuals who have the capacity to work, but do need different circumstances in which to be employed. And so for the city to implement those practices so that we can have inclusive hiring. I've been talking a lot about parks and green spaces for ages and abilities beyond the typical playground user. So when we think about parks and green spaces and playgrounds, typically it's like your standard metal playground designed for kind of like 3 to 10-year-olds. What about our teens? Particularly what about girls? What about seniors? That's super important. And Parks has really been working. So Parks and I have been working super diligently on this for a bit now. And I think we're getting to a much better place. So that's really, really, really great. Always one thing across Ward 11 is project coordination across the ward to reduce spending while improving outcomes. So for example, if you're going to do some paving improvement, if it's more than just resurfacing, how do we get underground and do more things? A great example of this, and generally the city is trying to do this, but sometimes I have projects kind of come through different streams. So I have a sanitary line, for example. I know I have a sanitary line that needs to be upgraded in order to support some development, but that sanitary line may run under where some other improvements are happening. And so I don't want other street improvements to happen before the road gets dug up to fix the sanitary line. So project coordination is super critical and important. So we do that all over the ward. Supporting community associations by improving the capital grant process for building improvements. That has been ongoing for 2 years. I came from a community association background. Volunteers can be super tired. And so trying to improve the process for them, we're getting there. Super good stuff. I talked a little bit about already working with schools and families to improve pedestrian safety. So again, that's getting funding into the spaces in order to make generally crosswalk safer. So city and regional economic development, talk a lot to a lot of people about how we're going to do this, where we're going to do this, connecting to them to the right people. So often our office is just an intake where people have ideas, they need to get connections into the city to talk about those things. And so then we are redirecting out. So we do a lot of redirection to help, especially with city and regional economic development. An example, so actually Tazar reached out to me to say, because they were thinking about opening a makerspace, it's kind of, I think, a bit on pause, but they wanted to like connect with some other small businesses in the city of Calgary. And so I kind of rallied some people and passed on some names. So that was that. Continuing to work on transit fare strategies and innovation in transit fare strategies. We support sport, rec, social agencies to navigate the city policies and gain access to funding and support. Again, never hits the floor of council. We spend a lot of time on that. I'm on 3 different provincial committees that support social services. Then I do oodles of speaking engagements. I don't think that's any surprise to anyone, but in particular, talking to kids. When I go talk to kids, I always like to ask them questions back. So that's a really, really big one. My team was like, tell them how much reading you do. I'm not going to tell you how much reading I do. We respond to constituent emails. We review development permits. We provide comments on those. So there's a lot of things that are happening in the back end that don't always make it to council, and all councilors do this. One of the reasons I do this, 15-minute Fridays, I'm at 17 minutes now, is to try to give you a sneak peek of the challenges that we face as councilors. And the realities of the role that we're in and the balance that we're trying to strike. So it may not seem to some people like we're trying to strike a balance, but we truly are. And everyone is going to approach it a little bit different, and everyone is potentially going to come to a different conclusion based on the inputs that they get or don't get, and the evidence and the research and the policies that they're weighing it against. That's why we have democracy, because then it allows people to see different people who are making, talking about why they do or don't make a decision. When big items do come before council, I post on my Facebook website. I post on the website how I came to that decision. So I try to be honest, and you may or may not agree with it. I know that. I know that you may or not agree with all, some, none of what I do. That is okay. That is actually okay. And I think I get a lot of people who try to sort of like shame me into doing their way, but I know that I'm going to disappoint people. I had to enter this job being comfortable knowing I was going to disappoint people sometimes. And sometimes that's disappointing people who voted for me. Sometimes that's disappointing people who didn't vote for me. Sometimes it's disappointing my own family who live across the ward. I know that. But I have to make decisions. That's my job. And it's really not easy sometimes. But I'll put it out there, and I will always be as honest as I can about why I'm doing something. And the choice is yours in the future, whether or not you support it. So with that, I hope you all have a happy Friday, a great long weekend. Please go down to Chinook Blast. There's lots of great things happening across the city for that. Get out, be around people, have conversations, listen. Listening goes both ways, right? If I'm listening to you, I need you to listen to me. But listen to your neighbors and talk to you, because I think consensus isn't what we think it is. And I think we're lacking on some conversation. And just some honesty that we are in a tumultuous time where there's lots of different directions we could go. And sometimes we go one way and sometimes we're going to go another way. That's it. That's all, friends. Have a great weekend.